let me give you another angle on the situation. Another angle on the situation is to consider about whether or not Augustine viewed Christ as bodily present. And again, I'm going to go to the Tractates on John. This is the previous one was Tractate 25, but now we're going to jump to Tractate 50, which relates to John 11. Here's what he says. He says, "Let them come to the church and hear where Christ is and take him. They may hear it from us, they may hear it from the gospel. He was slain by their forefathers, he was buried, he rose again, he was recognized by the disciples, he ascended before their eyes into heaven, and there sitteth at the right hand of the Father. And he who was judged is yet come, as judge of all. Let them hear and hold fast." Do they reply, "How shall I take hold of the absent? How shall I stretch up my hand into heaven, and take hold of one who is sitting there? Stretch up thy faith, and thou hast got hold. Thy forefathers held by the faith, hold thou with the heart, for the absent Christ is also present. But for his presence, we ourselves were unable to hold him." So in other words, Augustine has a view of Christ's presence, but he doesn't tell them, go grab the wafer. He says, stretch up your faith and grab with your heart. He's talking about grabbing not in some sort of literalistic way, but a spiritual meaning, a spiritual understanding to the situation. And again, I could go on. I could provide you with additional examples in Psalm 90, his commentary on Psalm 99 or 98, depending on how you count the Psalms. He says he's talking about the same passage from John 6. It happens that it comes up in his discussion there, and he explains that. Here's a quotation from him. "But he instructed them and saith unto them, It is the Spirit that quickeneth, but the flesh profiteth nothing. The words that I have spoken unto you, they are spirit and they are life. Understood spiritually what I have said, ye are not to eat this body which ye see, nor to drink that blood, which they who will crucify me shall pour forth. I have commended unto you a certain mystery, spiritually understood it will quicken, although it is needful that this be visibly celebrated, yet it must be spiritually understood." Notice that he's making remember how I said before, if you say that that it's only a figure or a sign, then you're anathema according to Canon 1 of Trent. But here, now I'm not saying that applies back through time, modern Roman Catholic theology, but here, how could he say it almost any more clearly than to say, and I don't mean that you hold this very body. You're not to eat this body which ye see, nor to drink that blood which they who will crucify me shall pour forth. In other words, it's not the literal body and blood. It's spiritually understood. It's a mystery. It's spiritually understood. It's not literally understood. And he says the same thing again in the next section of the same work. He says, "But the Lord insisted, it's the Spirit that gives life. The flesh is of no avail. The words I have spoken to you are spirit and life. Understand what I have told you in a spiritual way. You are not to eat this body that you can see, nor to drink the blood that will be shed by those who crucify me." So again, we have the same teaching over and over again. And here's another one. It's again Tractates on John. This time it's Tractate 27. And the specific part of the tractate is section 3. "But Jesus, knowing in himself that his disciples murmured at it, for they so said these things with themselves, that they might not be heard of him. But he who knew them in themselves, hearing within himself, answered and said, This offends you, because I said, I give you my flesh to eat and my blood to drink. This forsooth offends you. Then what if ye shall see the Son of Man ascending where he was before? What is this?" Now, here's the interesting point. I interrupt. Here's the interesting point. We're about to hear how he ties in this ascension of Christ with the spiritual understanding. Here's what he says. "Did he hereby solve the question that perplexed them? Did he hereby uncover the source of their offense? He did clearly, if only they understood, for they supposed that he was going to deal out his body to them. But he said that he was to ascend into heaven, of course, whole. When you shall see the Son of Man ascending where he was before, certainly then at least you will see that not in the manner you supposed as he dispensed his body, certainly then at least you will understand that his grace is not consumed by tooth biting. In other words, he mocks this literalistic kind of view by calling it consuming grace with tooth biting. And unfortunately, I really think that criticism, although there wasn't any doctrine of transubstantiation in Augustine's time, is applicable to that view, because that view tries to interpret the words of Jesus in a quasi-literal sense by actually making a carnal interpretation, by saying that the literal flesh is there. When you're biting into the wafer, you're actually biting the literal flesh. You don't see it that way, but that's really literally what's there, and the blood, and the divinity, and the soul. Of course, none of that's nothing except the body of Christ is the scriptural metaphor. But again, let me give you another example. I could probably give you countless examples, and it may not make a difference because someone might say it's a sign and something else. But in his in his answer to Adamantus, he says, after all, the Lord did not hesitate to say, "This is my body," when he gave a sign of his body. And that's not the sort of thing that someone who believes in transubstantiation would say. They're not going to say a sign of his body. They're going to say just his body. No, it doesn't make sense to say it's a sign, but perhaps someone would, and it just seems an odd statement to make. There's plenty more examples of this I could give you, but again, I think getting back to the point I just made about the ascension, I think that's sort of the third main point I would like to bring. The first point is that Augustine clearly indicates the situation is figurative. Really, the second point was that he explains that it's a sign. The third point ties into that second point about it being a sign and a figure, and it deals with the presence of Christ. And one Roman Catholic scholar named Gerhard Rauschen, he actually was able to get imprimatur on his work on Augustine, on the Eucharist in the first 6 centuries of the Church. He says, St. Augustine never discusses the question of the manner of Christ's presence. It seems, however, that he excludes the idea of a permanent presence of Christ in the Eucharist. So the exact presence, this scholar says, he doesn't discuss at all. So whether you can't really get transubstantiation without that additional data. However, I don't agree completely with Gerhard, but I would point out that in his Tractate 50 on John 11, there's a discussion about the presence of Jesus. And he says, it may also be, this is section 13, it says, it may also be understood this way, the poor ye have always with you, but me ye will not have always. The good may take it also as addressed to themselves, but not so as to be any source of anxiety, for he was speaking of his bodily presence. For in respect of his majesty, his providence, his ineffable, invisible, and invisible grace, his own words are fulfilled, Lo, I am with you always, even to the end of the world. But in respect of the flesh, he assumed as the Word, in respect of that which he was as the Son of the Virgin, of that wherein he was seized by the Jews, nailed to the tree, let down from the cross, enveloped in a shroud, laid in the sepulchre, and manifested in his resurrection, ye will not have him always. And I respectfully submit to you, to your listener, that if Rome's doctrine of transubstantiation is correct, you always have that very body that was crucified, because if the Mass is really a representation of the sacrifice, and if that's Christ present in this very full and complete sense that's alleged, then, my dear listener, then there's no possible way that Augustine's view can be squeezed in, because he thinks there's no bodily presence of Christ, that there's lots of spiritual presence, but no bodily presence. So, in conclusion, the 3 points I hope you'll remember are, number one, he says it's figurative, quite clearly. He says it's a sign, quite clearly. And he says there's no bodily presence because of the ascension. And on these 3 points, you may rightly conclude that what Trent taught, Augustine did not teach. Thanks very much.